الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن اهتدى بهديه واقتدى بسنته إلى يوم الدين. ما بعد، فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. رسالة الشريف. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. اللهم بارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. Respected brothers, elders and my young friends, alhamdulillah, we are continuing with our series on the four great Imams. And very briefly, just to summarize what we have discussed so far, we first discussed an overview of who these four Imams were, how these four Imams came about, how these madhahib came about. And we answered a few of the objections that many of the ghair muqallids have in regards to following a madhab and doing taqleed. And then we commenced on the life of Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi. And we mentioned regarding Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi, and it's important, like we mentioned last week, that it's important that when we study these individuals, we study them holistically. Look at their entire lives. You know, we learned regarding Imam Abu Hanifa that in regards to his business, he was a businessman, he was a wealthy businessman. But how truthful was he in his business? We mentioned many incidents. And if a person like this, when it comes to something of the dunya, they are so careful, then would this person really hamper with the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Never. So we discussed regarding Abu Hanifa in terms of his business. And then we mentioned regarding one of the great teachers of the time, Abu Amir al-Sha'bi rahimahullahu ta'ala, who inspired him. Imam Abu Hanifa started his studies later on. And this just shows that if a person hasn't studied till later on, it doesn't matter. They can still study later on. There's no age. You can study when you're in your 40s and 50s. There's nothing to be shy about. So when Imam Abu Hanifa in his 20s, Imam Abu Amir Sha'bi sees him in the marketplace and he says to him, I see great potential in you. And this was him inspiring Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi. A few good words. You inspire someone with your words. And Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi, he went on to study. Initially he started to study ilmul kalam, theology, and he used to have debates. And thereafter he realized, you know what, I'm wasting my time debating with people. Then he went into looking at the Quran and the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, extracting rulings from the Quran and the Sunnah, and this is how the fiqh came up. So continuing with that, we mentioned one of his first teachers and his main teacher of Imam Abu Hanifa was someone by the name of Hammad ibn Sulaiman. Hammad ibn Sulaiman was only 9 years older than Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi. And Imam Abu Hanifa says, I stayed with Imam Hammad ibn Sulaiman for 10 years. And he says, after I studied for 10 years, imagine 10 years with one teacher. He says, after I studied with him for 10 years, I thought one day, he says, I left the house and I thought, you know what, when I go to the masjid today, I'm going to have my own circle. My teacher will have his circle, but I'm going to establish my own circle. 10 years, more than enough. He says, as soon as I entered the masjid and I saw my teacher, I forgot about all of my thoughts and I went and sat in the company of my teacher, Hammad ibn Sulaiman. He says, once it happened that my teacher, Hammad ibn Sulaiman, he had to attend a janazah of a relative in Basra. So he says that he was going to be off for some time. So he says that he put me in charge of the circle, i.e. his circle of knowledge. And he says, I began to conduct these circles that my teacher would conduct. And he says, I stayed in that position for 2 months. And he says, in those 2 months, there were 60 new questions that came up. He says, I answered all of these 60 questions. He says, when my teacher returned, I put these questions to him and I told him that these are the answers. And he says that my teacher agreed with me on 40 of them, on 20 of them, he did not agree with me. So Imam Abu Hanifa said that, you know what, as long as my teacher is alive, I'm going to stay in the company of my teacher. So he continued until the demise of his respected teacher Hammad ibn Sulaiman. Now when he first came into the company of his teacher for the first time, he sat at the back. You know, many new students, when they come to a class, they'll sit at the back. But Imam Abu Hanifa, his teacher Hammad, he immediately realized after a few days the potential of this student. So he brought him to the front of the class. And after a few more days, he realized that, you know what, this is a very special student. So he made him sit next to him. And he would sit next to his teacher, Hammad ibn Sulaiman. And he would He would even do the shopping for his teacher, and he was very, very committed to his teacher. When Hamad ibn Sulaiman, his teacher, he went to Basra one day, again to the house of a close relative who had passed away. He was crying. So someone asked him that, why are you crying? He says, I am missing my dear student Nu'man ibn Thabit. This was the connection that he had with his respected teacher. Now, he lived only 7 blocks away from his teacher. It's still quite a distance, 7 blocks away. Hartington's probably a few blocks away from here. He lived 7 blocks away from his teacher. But you look at the adab, look at the respect, look at the etiquette that Imam Abu Hanifa, rahmatullahi alayhi, had. Today we've lost all kind of adab, unfortunately. They say in Urdu, कि adab ही से इंसान इंसान बनता है. Adab जो न सीखे वो हैवान है. It is through adab a person becomes a human being. If a person doesn't have adab, a person becomes like an animal. I remember when I went to Haramain Sharifain many years ago, in 2016 for Hajj, and we were praying Salah there, and unfortunately, some of the Arabs, when it comes to the Quran Sharif, there's no kind of adab. It was raining and he put the Quran onto the floor and he was doing sajda on the floor, onto the Quran. And I'm thinking, Allahu Akbar, where is the adab here? Just very, small things in our life, we need to bring adab, especially into our salah, etc. as well. So it comes regarding Abu Hanifa that he would not even face his feet towards the direction of his teacher's house. And he would not answer the call of nature again towards his teacher's house. This was just the adab that Imam Abu Hanifa, rahmatullahi alayhi, had. When a person has adab, Allah Ta'ala grants them that nur in their heart of ilm as well. One of our great shuyukh of Deoban, Allama Anwar Shah Kashmiri rahmatullahi alayhi, when he would be studying his kutub, his books. So if anyone has seen the Subcontinent Prince, you have the text, you have the matan, and then around it you have a hashia, footnotes. So you write around it. So many of us, if we had a book like that, we'll move the kitab like this, we'll start writing. Might turn the kitab upside down, start writing. Allama Anwar Shah Kashmiri, what he would do, he would write his notes, and when it would be the time to go and write on the side or at the top, he would turn himself and he would go right around the table and write on the other side. This was the adab, because this is, at the end of the day, the book is alatul ilm. It is a means of knowledge. So he would have respect for that thing which is a means of knowledge as well. So this was Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi. He would not face his feet in the direction of his teacher's house. Now his teacher passed away at the age of 49, quite young. And unanimously at that time, everyone agreed that the rightful person to take Hamad's seat in Kufa was going to be none other than Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi. And then he went on to become, the great Imam. This is why from all the ulama and all the scholars, there is only one Imam that you will find who has the title of Imam al-Azam. Imam means Imam, leader. And A'zam, the greatest, the mightiest, the most proficient leader, and that was for Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi. This is why if you were to go to Baghdad in Iraq now, they have a full area where there's majority Sunni living there. They have an area there which is called A'zamiyya, and this is where Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi is actually buried as well. He left a massive legacy, and they've named an entire complex after Imam al-Azam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi. Different reasons why he was called Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi. Many ulama have written different things. They say Hanif means ink. He didn't have a child called Hanifa, but Hanif means ink. So they say father of ink because he used to write a lot. So this was Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi. But like I said, even after he studied with his teacher Hamad and he took the seat in Kufa, he didn't stop studying. People think that I'm 20, 25, that's it, I'm going to stop. And then we have sharam. We feel shy. To go into the company of someone and study. He did not stop studying. He studied with the likes of Ibrahim al-Nakhai, Imam Sha'bi. Imam Bukhari comes later on. He comes, a few generations after Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi. In fact, Imam Abu Hanifa's students are the teachers of Imam Bukhari rahmatullahi alayhi. Now, he spent many years in Makkah Mukarramah as well. And one of the great benefits of him spending time in Makkah Mukarramah was that he took benefit from many different people, from different scholars from different thoughts, etc. So he spent time in Makkah Mukarramah, and it was very common that the years he spent in Makkah Mukarramah, whenever you would enter the Haram at night, you would see two people doing tawaf at that time. One would be someone by the name of Sufyan al-Thawri rahmatullahi alayhi, a great muhaddith, and the other was Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi. He performed Hajj 55 times. 55 times he performed Hajj. He wasn't like a tour leader or something. It's just, the dedication. He was very, very committed as well. So he stayed in Makkah Mukarramah for many years, and he benefited from many, many people. From those in Makkah Mukarramah, the shuyukh in Makkah Mukarramah. He benefited from those in Medina Munawwara. And he also benefited, obviously, from his own place in Kufa. There were 1,500 Sahaba who actually resided in Kufa, in Iraq as well. So he benefited from all these different people. And the main person whom he benefited from, and from the Hanafi school of thought, is based mainly on the sayings of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. And the Hanafi school of thought, like we mentioned last week, is built on this. Now, it's also mentioned regarding him that people would call him the pillar. People would call him the pillar because when he would be in salah, he would be very, very still like a pillar. And when a person is like this, sometimes rumors start spreading. That this Imam is next level. He prays, his Fajr Salah with the same wudu as Isha. And this wasn't true at the time. He wouldn't do this. He would actually do this. He was very dedicated to his ibadah. He was punctual with his ibadah, but then he wasn't actually doing this. And one day Imam Abu Hanifa was walking past two women, and they were talking, and he overheard them talking. And one says to the other, do you know who that is? That is Imam Abu Hanifa. He prays Fajr with the same wudu as Isha. And he wasn't doing this, and he's thinking, Allah, this is what people expect from me. From that day on, he committed to pray his Fajr Salah with the same wudu as Isha Salah. This is why we find a dua from the companions radiyallahu anhum ajma'in, a beautiful dua. Allahumma la tu'akhidni bima yaqulun, waghfir li ma la ya'lamun, waj'alni khayran mimma yadhunnun. Allah, do not hold me accountable for what people think of me, or what people say about me. They don't really know the reality about me. Yeah? They are praising me, but they don't know, how I am really as a person. وَغْفِرْنِي مَا لَا يَعْلَمُونَ. Allah, forgive me in regards to those things that people don't know about me, i.e. the dark side of me. Yeah, they don't know about it. And وَجْعَلْنِي خَيْرًا مِمَّا يَظُنُّونَ. Allah, make me better than what their thoughts are about me as well. What a beautiful dua that we learn from the Sahaba radiyallahu anhum ajma'in. Another incident mentioned in Tabaqat ibn Sa'ad. Imam Abu Hanifa was once in the masjid, and the Imam in Isha Salah, he recited Surah Zilzal, إِذَا زُلْزِلَتِ الْأَرْضُ زِلْزَالَهَا. Where Allah Ta'ala talks about the day of judgment. And then Allah Ta'ala at the end says, فَمَنْ يَعْمَلْ مِثْقَالَ ذَرَّةٍ خَيْرًا يَرَى وَمَنْ يَعْمَلْ مِثْقَالَ ذَرَّةٍ شَرًّا يَرَى. That whoever does an atom's weight of good on that day, he will see it. And whoever does evil, he will see it as well on that day. So Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi, after the Isha Salah, he started to cry and cry and cry, pondering over these verses that were recited in Salah. And he's holding onto his beard and he's crying and he's crying, oh Allah, forgive Abu Hanifa. Oh Allah, forgive Abu Hanifa. Imagine, if my evil is to be seen on that day, Ya Allah. He's crying and crying. Now the caretaker of the masjid, who was also the muazzin, he's waiting for Imam Abu Hanifa. And everyone has left the masjid, and the caretaker needs to close the masjid. And he's waiting and he's waiting and he's waiting, and he's thinking, Abu Hanifa isn't moving anywhere. So he thought, what, I'll just come back at Fajr time. So Imam Abu Hanifa, he's continuing. This caretaker comes back at Fajr time, and what he sees Imam Abu Hanifa in that same position, making dua to Allah Ta'ala, holding his beard, crying and crying and crying to Allah Ta'ala. And it's nearly time for Fajr Salah. So the muazzin, the caretaker, comes to Abu Hanifa and he says that, what time it is? What time it is? He says it's nearly Fajr time. If it was us guys, we get Snapchat out, been in the masjid all night. No. Imam Abu Hanifa, he grabs onto the muazzin and he says, don't you dare tell anybody what you just saw right now. And you know what he did? He went and told everyone. The fastest way to not tell anyone is to tell someone not to tell anyone, and everyone will find out. So this was regarding Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi being devoted in his worship. Now when it comes to his tolerance, Abdullah ibn Mubarak rahmatullahi, great muhaddith, he says, I've never seen Imam Abu Hanifa backbiting anyone. People were opposed. When a person is doing well, when a person is excelling in any field, you'll have people that will criticize you. But he would never ever backbite anyone. Sufyan al-Thawri says that he was just too smart to backbite anyone. Why would he want to waste his good deeds on someone? So it comes regarding one of his neighbors. Imam Zahabi mentions this narration that he had a neighbor who was a drunkard, who would come home every single night, and he would be singing, he would be dancing, and he would be making lots of noise. Now we know what rowdy neighbors are like, and we can't tolerate it, we can't handle it. After a few days, you're knocking on the door, you're knocking on the wall, be quiet. Sometimes you go to the front door and you're knocking on the door. Imam Hanifa rahmatullahi, he would hear this every single night, and this person would be saying, Adahuni, Adahuni. They've abandoned me. He's talking about his family and friends because of his drinking habits. So again, Imam Hanifa, he would tolerate this. Even though he would be devoted to his worship, he would just tolerate it. Now one night, he doesn't hear his neighbor saying Allahuni, and he doesn't hear his neighbor, singing and dancing away. One night's gone, 2 nights, 3 nights are passing, thinking what's going on. So he comes to the Khalifa of the time, Abu Ja'far, and he says that, where's my neighbor? He says that your neighbor, he had borrowed so much money of people, he had amassed the debt of 80,000 dirhams. 80,000 dirhams he had amassed a debt of. Imam Abu Hanifa says that I take responsibility for him. Free him and I will pay off his debt. So Imam Abu Hanifa, he pays off his debt. And this person comes out and he says, I've been giving you taklif all these years. He says that, so Imam Abu Hanifa says to him that you've been saying, Adahuni, they've abandoned me, who's abandoned you? I've not abandoned you. I've come to rescue you, I've come to take you back. So it says regarding him after this that this person became a person of the first saf in the masjid. Imam Abu Hanifa, he was connected to his people. He was a people's person. He wasn't an imam who wasn't connected to the people. He was an imam who was very, very well connected to his community. And people would ask him questions. Sometimes he would give some funny responses as well. Someone comes to him and he says that, Imam, I've buried some money somewhere and I can't find it. I've just buried it somewhere and really I cannot think of where I put it. Imam Hanifa says to him, just go home and pray salah. Go home and pray salah. This guy is thinking that I want to know where my treasure and where my money has been buried. Why is he telling me to pray salah? And literally a few moments later, this person comes over, he says, I found it. He says, what happened? He says, as soon as I started my salah, I remembered. Imam Hanifa says, I knew. As soon as you start your salah, shaitan puts thoughts into your mind. He doesn't want you to pray salah, he told you where your wealth was. So this was, the kind of responses that Imam Abu Hanifa, rahmatullahi alayhi, would give. And he had many, many students. And, they weren't only students, they became his ashab. They became his companions. They say 36 of his students reached the level of ashab, where they would sit with him, they would argue with him, they would debate with him. And he had many, many great students, the likes of Imam Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani, Imam Abu Yusuf, rahmatullahi alayhi. And this is, and we mentioned in the first week as well, the Hanafi madhab is not only based on the thoughts and the sayings of Imam Abu Hanifa, rahmatullahi alayhi. Rather, it's a whole school of thought. It's even the sayings of Imam Zufar and Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Abu Yusuf, Imam Muhammad, rahimahullahu ta'ala, and the other students of Imam Abu Hanifa, rahmatullahi alayhi. And people say that, what is taqdeed? We had, unfortunately, many ghair muqallids, they say that, to do taqdeed is shirk. You shouldn't do taqdeed, you shouldn't follow an imam, it's shirk. So, and we mentioned this, that what do they say? They say follow the Quran and the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And you think that, these imams, they followed anything but the Quran and the Sunnah. Look at the Hanafi school of thought, look at the Shafi'i school of thought, or Maliki or Hanbali. Everything is taken from the Quran and the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala alaihi wasallam. So he had many great students. And a person is either recognized, number one, through their students or through their teachers. Through their students or through their teachers. Alhamdulillah, our scholarship goes back up to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We have a direct chain which goes back to Nabi sallallahu ta'ala alaihi wasallam. Even in our fiqh, if you look at the salah in the Maliki school of thought, Hanbali or Shafi'i or Hanafi, everything has a chain of narration which goes back to Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala alaihi wasallam. Now, there were many people at the time who had, some kind of reservations for Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi, even the likes of Imam Malik rahmatullahi alayhi, the great Imam of Medina, whom we'll talk about in our next session. So Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi, they would meet each other. When Imam Abu Hanifa would go to Medina Munawwara, they would meet each other, and they had so much mutual respect for each other that as soon as they would meet, they would put their differences aside. And Imam Abu Hanifa, he even sent 2 of his best students to study with Imam Malik rahmatullahi alayhi. There was a great scholar, Imam al-Awza'i rahimahullah ta'ala. He had some reservations for Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi. So there was another scholar, Ibn Mubarak, Abdullah ibn Mubarak. He compiled all of the ahadith from Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi, and he compiled a very thick compilation by the name of Nu'man. So he sent it to Imam al-Awza'i and told him that read this book. Imam al-Awza'i, he read this book for 3 days straight. It was a very thick compilation. So after 3 days, Abdullah ibn Mubarak asked him that, what do you think of the person who wrote this book? He says he's a very intellectual person. He seems like an amazing person. So Abdullah ibn Mubarak says it is that very same person whom you have reservations about. This is Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi, and they put their differences aside. Now there were also many political issues, like we will discuss in regards to Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal in a few weeks. Imam Abu Hanifa also faced, there were many political issues, and he was prosecuted as well at the time. Now before he passed away, Imam Abu Hanifa, he made a wasiyah. He says, number one, that do not bury me in a place which has been occupied unjustly. And number two is that do not bury me in a place which has been brought by interest. Now he passed away in the year 150 after Hijrah. And it's mentioned that his janazah was read 6 times. And each time 50,000 people, they prayed janazah upon Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi, which just shows the acceptance of Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi. Now, very briefly, just to end, I'm going to mention the methodology of Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi without making it too technical. Okay? Without making it too technical, just very briefly, how the Hanafi school of thought, it works. Okay, so Imam Abu Hanifa, his first source was to go to the Quran. Okay? Anything which goes through the Quran. So Allah Ta'ala, even our salah, Imam Abu Hanifa would first look at the Quran, look at the verses of the Quran. So even regarding salah, what do we say regarding wudu, the 4 farad of wudu? So Allah Ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu idha qumtum ila as-salah faghsilu wujuhakum. When you stand for salah, faghsilu wujuhakum. Wash your face. Wa aydiyakum ila al-marafiq. Wash your hands up till and including the elbows. So this is 2. Wamsahu bi ru'usikum. And do masah of your head. And وَأَرْجُلَكُمْ إِلَى الْكَعْبَيْنِ, and wash your feet until and including the ankles. So this goes through the Quran first. So Hanafi school of thought, everything, and this is where Imam Abu Hanifa has differed from some of the other some of the other A'imma, where Imam Abu Hanifa would look at the generic verses of the Quran. So this is number 1. After this, Imam Abu Hanifa, he would look at the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he was very, very strict in accepting hadith. He would only accept those, obviously, which were sahih, which were hasan. And because at that time, because of the political fitna at that time, there were many, many fabricated ahadith flying around. So Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullah, he was very, very strict in accepting hadith. And this is why, many of the Salafi brothers, they say that, Imam Abu Hanifa didn't know hadith, and, the Hanafi school of thought is based on weak hadith. And we already discussed this, that Imam Bukhari came later on, a few generations after Imam Abu Hanifa. At the time when Imam Abu Hanifa took these ahadith, they were sahih. Maybe later on in the chain of narration, there was a narrator who was weak, which as a result of that made that narration weak. But at the time that Imam Abu Hanifa took those narrations, they were sahih. So this, the second go-to after the Quran was the ahadith of Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa sallam. Thereafter, he would take the verdicts of the Sahaba radiyallahu anhum ajma'in, be Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, Abu Musa Ash'ari radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, Sayyidina Ali radiyallahu anhu. And then his 4th thing was qiyas, analogy and reasoning. It wasn't based on his own thoughts. What you feel like. Look at the Quran, look at the Sunnah, and the sayings of the Sahaba, and apply a ruling according to that. So Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, he applies a ruling, and we'll end on this. So what does a pregnant woman do in regards to her fasting? Now you won't find anything in the Quran. What do you find in the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam? So he would say that, what does Allah Ta'ala say in regards to a person who is ill? فَمَنْ كَانَ مِنْكُمْ مَرِيضًا أَوْ عَلَى سَفَرٍ. If a person is ill, then make it about a different time. فَعِدَّةٌ مِنْ أَيَّامٍ أُخَرٍ. So you put a pregnant woman in the same bracket as well. Okay? Because she is sick as well. So this is how qiyas actually works. So he passed away in Baghdad, and he's, like I mentioned, he's buried in Baghdad. There's an entire complex there as well. And this, people ask that, how did Imam Abu Hanifa become so accepted? And the main thing is the sincerity of individual. When a person is sincere in their efforts, remember, he was the one who started all of these efforts off. Like Imam Shafi'i would say, النَّاسُ عِيَالٌ عَلَى أَبِي حَنِيفَةَ فِي الْفِقْهِ. Everyone is dependent on Imam Abu Hanifa in fiqh. When it came to fiqh, he was the one who started off, looking at the Quran, looking at the Sunnah, and applying rulings from that. And I'll end on one thing. Sheikh Muhammad Awama, one of the great scholars, he says that people say Imam Abu Hanifa wasn't a hadith person. He's written something amazing. Who was the closest to Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam? Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiyallahu ta'ala. Now when you open the corpus of a hadith, do you find many narrations from Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiyallahu anhu? Hardly any narrations are from Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiyallahu anhu. Are you going to say that Abu Bakr didn't know any hadith? Of course, Abu Bakr radiyallahu anhu, he was the most knowledgeable from the Sahaba. If there was something that the Sahaba were unsure of, they would go to Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiyallahu anhu, and they would get the answer from Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. So just because, he didn't narrate many ahadith, are we going to say Imam Abu Hanifa, he didn't know ahadith? In those times, to become a faqih, to become a shaykh, you need to know ahadith. So someone asked Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal rahmatullahi alayhi, that if someone knows 100,000 ahadith, would you consider him to be an imam, a faqih, a shaykh? He said no. He said, what about 200? What about 300, 400? About 500, he says maybe if he knows 500,000 ahadith, would consider him to be a faqih and imam, a shaykh. And he would consider Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi to be a faqih. So imagine how many ahadith Imam Abu Hanifa actually knew. So this was, over the last 2 weeks, a brief overview on the life of Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi. May Allah Ta'ala shower his blessings upon Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi. Likewise, we're greatly indebted to the efforts of Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi. And it's important for us in this day and age to know and to study these individuals holistically, because we have individuals, every time they can hurry on the street, every youngster or on social media, people putting themselves in the same bracket as Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi, and the disrespect for Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi. It's important that we know our tradition and we know our great Imams. May Allah Ta'ala accept, and may Allah Ta'ala give us a tawfiq to amal inshaAllah Ta'ala. Inshallah we'll have our show.